Hey, what's up everybody? Isaac here coming to you with another New World video. And today's video is going to be an in-depth guide to PVE DPS. And we are going to cover many different builds, many different concepts we're going to cover. Like gems that you want to use in your weapons and in your gear. The perks you want to have on your weapons, your gear. And the different types of builds that you want within your group when you're running your dungeons. So we're going to go from the basics to super in-depth, whether you're just getting started out, what you need to be working towards, and we're going to talk concepts as far as getting you ready to work your way up to those M10s. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is your gear. Really important. If you're going to be a DPS, I highly suggest you go for a light equipment load. That's because base damage, you do a bonus 20%. Medium, you only do bonus 10%. And heavy, no bonus at all. So how do you maximize your lightweight gear setup? Well, you can rock all 5 pieces of light, but you could also have 1 piece of medium. And if you make that medium piece your chest, you are going to be optimizing yourself the best you possibly can. So for this particular example, I have a light headgear, light gloves, light pants, and light boots, and a medium chest piece, which maximizes my damage mitigation. So say a medium piece, for example, it's going to have a higher rating for armor and physical than say a light piece is going to. So the closer we can get to this 13 without surpassing it and going into the medium, well, the better off we are going to be. We're going to have more damage mitigation. So I did start off a couple of my builds that I have a medium, or I have all 5 light pieces, and you can get away with it if that's what you end up with. But ideally, eventually you're working towards having that perfect setup. 4 pieces of light with a medium chest. So getting started off at the very basics, you just hit level 60. You don't need to have the ward on you. This is the most important piece that you need once you start going into those mutations. But getting started off, you might not have that. But I wouldn't get carried away with leveling your gear up that doesn't have ward. Make sure you do find a piece with ward before you start leveling up. You don't want to waste your shards. And that's also why I think it's important that you know what you should be working towards as a DPS. You want to have the proper setup before you start wasting shards and leveling up the wrong stuff just to realize that, wow, I wasted a whole ton of shards. But the thing is, you're going to end up wasting, so to speak, some, but it won't be a waste because it'll be an investment to get you started and get you going until you find some better pieces. So what particular gear set, we have a bunch of different mob types, and what gear set should you go for first? Personally, I'd say corrupted, just because there are so many different corrupted dungeons that you're going to be able to use it in. We got the Tempest up here, that's corrupted. We got the Dynasty Shipyard, that's corrupted. We got the Depths over here, that's corrupted. And then we do also have the Ennead, which is a combination of corrupted and ancient. So you are going to need corrupted if you do the Ennead mutations. And then I think Starstone has corrupted in it as well. Is it corrupted and lost, or is it ancient? I think it's corrupted. Well, can't remember. It's been a little while since I did that one. But that would be a very good set to start off with because you're going to get many options to use it. And rumor has it there are going to be some gear changes coming along, but you don't really want to wait until then because, well, that could be, I think I maybe heard rumor next fall is when that might come. So if you say, well, I'm going to wait until next fall before I start leveling stuff up, well, you're wasting a lot of time making progress and having some fun. So I wouldn't hold off on upgrading gear for now. I would just keep going right along and having some fun. But anyways, with your gear, ideally what I would suggest you looking for is dexterity and strength. And if you find a little bit of con, that's okay, but you don't want to get too carried away by having con on everything. It can be tempted to say, well, if I get con, then it's going to be ideal because I can use it for every type of build, whether I want to play mage, whether I want to play melee, whether I want to play spear, whether I want to play blunderbuss, whether I want to play hammer, great axe. But the problem is, you start putting con on all of your gear, and it brings your con so high that you're not going to be able to do very good damage. As a DPS, I would highly recommend that you get started out with trying to get by with 100 con. If need be, bump it up to 150. And if you're really struggling, go to 200. But as a DPS, you really should be 100 or less. Long term, sure, if you need to get by, go 150. But the sooner you can learn how to start dropping your con down to 100, the better off you are going to be. You're going to help your team more because as a DPS, your job is to get rid of the mobs as fast as you can. The longer the mobs are left alive, well, the longer time they have to take you and your teammates out. So for our gear offs, it's going to depend on what we're running. We're going to talk a little bit about some mage builds and whatnot too. But generally speaking, melee is still king when it comes to DPS in dungeons. But there are a couple of exceptions where mages can do quite well, especially in the Genesis. Genesis has gotten really tough at M10s, and some of the groups that I ran with that were running fire staffs, and I built a fire staff build myself, well, some of those groups were the groups that were doing the best. So definitely can't go wrong with a fire staff build in Genesis. It used to be that fire staff was extremely, just didn't quite cut it compared to melee. But with recent changes over the past few months, it's gotten a lot stronger than it used to be. So it's definitely a viable option to run fire staff, like in Genesis, for example. So if you're building a Genesis set, you gotta start looking for intelligence. And one handy thing is there is a named set that you can farm, and that's going to be your blighted growth stuff. And I'm pretty sure this stuff drops from Genesis mutations, so you might have to get started in Gen before you can get this stuff. But one little trick I can show you, let's see here. If you go on to the internet, you search New World Database, and you go to newworlddatabase.info, and you can type in here Angry Earth Ward, and we click on this little guy and we scroll on down, and it's going to give us all of the pieces of gear that have Angry Earth Ward on. So we can kind of mouse over it and we see, oh, that's strength and dexterity, but it's only 570, so it's not going to do us any good. It has to be at least 590 in order to help us out for the mutations. So this is kind of talking more long term once you're trying to get ready for those M10s and you really want to start getting strong gear. But obviously the sooner that you can start getting strong gear, the better. But let's keep scrolling right along, trying to find that piece that we're looking for. There it is. So we have this blighted growth set, and it is a light chest, so it's a 5-piece light, and you can get away with this light, but if you can, definitely try to find a medium piece for your chest. So let's go ahead and click on one of these pieces, And where does it drop? It drops from the Blighted Greenskeeper. So that's who you're going to have to get this from, and it is only from a mutated expedition. So this little website is going to give you tons of useful information. So strongly recommend that you use it, and it's going to make life a whole lot easier for you. So you are going to have to get started doing mutations before you get this set, and that's just kind of the way it is. You gotta get started, even if your gear isn't the greatest. Just get some Angry Earth Ward and, just get started, and eventually you will start getting the better drops. So moving right along, let's talk a little bit about different weapon combos. So my favorite weapon combo is all around. Well, I shouldn't say it's my favorite because I have many favorites. They're all my favorite in reality. I like to build a set of each and every build for each and every dungeon. But one of the most versatile builds, and I did make a video on this specific build. You can go check it out. It's an axe hatchet build. Very versatile build. And you can get by with this build in every single dungeon. You're just going to have to find a hatchet with the specific bane you need and an axe with the specific bane you need. At the very basic level, that is enough. So what do you want on your hatchet? Personally, I like Refreshing Torrent. You can do a throw-in hatchet build, and you're going to want to look for Empowering Rended Throw, I think it's called, or something like that. But we won't get too in-depth with that for now. But this build is going to be better for big AoE damage. The other build is good for single target. Gonna give you some high DPS against like bosses. So, but yeah, this is a great all-around build. So on your axe, I prefer to have Enfeebling Maelstrom. I do not have it on this specific axe. I don't think I have an Angry Earth axe yet with Enfeebling Maelstrom. But one thing that you can get away with, make sure that your hatchet has the bane for whichever mob type you want. And you can get started with having an axe that just has Enfeebling Maelstrom, and then hopefully one or two other good perks. And then you could use that axe for every single dungeon, but make sure that your actual DPS weapon has bane. It's better if your axe does too, but especially getting started off, and the thing is, your axe isn't meant to be the one doing the DPS. It's just there for crowd control. It's there to use the skills and then switch to your actual DPS weapon. So just one little thought to keep in mind. So that's my favorite build to use. It's got good crowd control with your axe, and then it's got good DPS with your hatchet with a little bit of survivability. You got your Berserk, which gives you some extra movement speed and some extra self-healing. And with the Defy Death setup, let's go click on the hatchet. If you come down here, you receive lethal damage. When you receive lethal damage, avoid death and become invulnerable for 0.5 seconds. And restore 500 HP plus 50% of your base health upon activation. So that is a very strong perk, but 0.5 seconds isn't really long, and if you're really in trouble, you're going to go down anyways. You're not going to be able to escape within that period of time, but there are definitely plenty of times where that can go off and save your life. So very, very strong perk to have. And let's talk a little bit about gems. Right now I actually have taunt gems in both of these. I do a lot of tanking, so I'm constantly switching gems on different things. I prefer to try to get one of each, but for something like a hatchet, I love using hatchet for tanking, and I like to have Refreshing Torrent for my DPS or my tank build, so it's easy enough just to swap out gems. So one thing you can always use is a Cut Pristine Opal. not necessarily always going to be your best choice. You know, say specifically for Genesis, you could put this one, it'd be just fine. But I would say go ahead and put a Ruby. Even though Angry Earth is already weak to Slash, they have a 20%, you get 20% bonus damage with Slash. But you get a 30% bonus with Fire. So let's take a look at this. So we get an extra 15% damage while your stamina is not full. Yeah, that's very good. But, it's potentially even better than a Ruby, but it just depends on the situation. So a Ruby is going to convert 50% of your damage to Fire. So Slash gets 20% bonus. Fire gets 30% bonus in Genesis. So 50% of our damage is going to be guaranteed 10% higher damage every time, no matter what. So the other option is to get 15% of damage occasionally, on 100% of our damage, which is obviously, a lot more. But if we don't want to worry about whether or not we are doing damage while our stamina is not full, which pretty often we're going to be. So that's definitely, especially with the hatchet. The hatchet's a good one to have this for. So, it definitely would probably be the better option to put a cut pristine opal in there. But putting a ruby in there is also going to make you do more damage consistently. So not a bad option to put a ruby in there either. So it is kind of important that you pay attention to what gems you're putting in, because if you put the wrong gem, you could actually start doing less damage. For example, let's take a look at the Genesis right now. It's mutated, and it's a void mutation. So what everyone's putting into their armor is these cut pristine amethysts. We put these into our armor and we call it good. We're gonna take a lot less damage. But what I've seen some people do is they'll put these in all of their armor, all their jewelry, which is good and fine. But then I'll see them go and slot them also into their weapons. But that is a big problem, because we take that and we put it into our weapon, and now we're not doing slash damage for half of it. Instead, we're doing a conversion to void damage, which they are not weak to. So we'll actually do less damage by taking this amethyst and putting it into our weapon. So definitely something you do not want to do. But yeah, so it is important that you make sure you have the right gem in your weapons. Like right now I have taunt weapons. If I was to DPS, I would not want to have carnelians slotted. I'd rather have, for example, that slotted or a ruby. I happen to have a ruby inside of my other axe, and the only reason I did that is because I think I had a taunt gem in here, and I had to get it out of there, so I just said, well, I'll put a ruby in there. It's going to help me do a little bit of extra damage. But, while getting the taunt gem out. So 10% extra damage on 50% of my damage, versus having the taunt gem and stealing the aggro from the tank. We definitely don't want that happening. So gotta be careful that you got the right gems inside of your weapons. Very important. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of builds you can use. So you can definitely get away with having 3 people in your squad running axe and hatchet. But like I was mentioning earlier, the highest damage build in the game is arguably something similar to this. You have your rapier bleed build. Like, you gotta have all of the right perks and all of the right everything to make it the maximum, absolute best possible, highest DPS in the game. My build isn't 1000% maximized, but it's got pretty good build. This isn't I got a better one than that somewhere in here. I upgraded it, but anyways, this is a build that you would not want to have all 3 of your DPS running. It's fine to have 1 player running this build, but you wouldn't even want to have 2 preferably running this build. So there are some builds that are better than others inherently, just because, for example, like I said, there's some builds you could get away with having 3 people running one build, but there's other builds that you are going to be having a tough time having all 3 people running the same build. So kind of important, to be versatile, have a build that is going to work in many situations, and then as you progress, maybe pick up a couple of new builds that are going to work. Granted that you don't end up with 2 other DPS in your group running that exact same build. So another example is, it would be perfectly fine to have 1 person in your group running axe and hammer. Neither one of these are super high damage output, but they both do a lot of AoE, and if we were running this particular build, both of these run off of strength, so we would have to make sure that we do not have any dexterity in our build. We'd have to be all strength and all constitution if we were going to run this build. And although typically you're not going to have anybody running this build, you're going to have 1 DPS running an axe and 1 DPS running a hammer, and these are going to be ran in your back bar, so to speak. Your main weapon is going to be your DPS weapon, and then your DPS are going to have a secondary weapon for crowd control, or for adding rend, or for adding weakness. But there is one reason why it could be handy having 1 person doing maximum crowd control. And for example, really good reason why this is a strong build. Let's get one of our proper axes in here. I should have one, I think. Maybe not. Is this? No, that's not the one. We'll just throw this one back in here and we'll pretend. So we take a look at this. The main perk we're looking for on our axe is Enfeebling Maelstrom. And let's just pretend that this was Bane. So if we had an axe with Enfeebling Maelstrom and Bane for a specific mob type, we would be all set with our axe. And then on our hammer, the main thing we're looking for is Sundering, Shockwave, and Bane. So there we go. So why is that going to be so good? Well, we are going to be applying tons of rend, and we are going to be doing incredible amounts of crowd control. And one reason why this is going to work good, sometimes if you have 1 person running a hammer and 1 person running axe and they're out of sync, the person with the hammer goes in and he stuns the group. And then you have your guy with the axe, he goes in and tries to do a gravity well, but it might not work because the troops are stunned and they're not getting grouped up, and they kind of got wasted. But say you got the one guy with the axe and the hammer, he goes in and first, maybe he does a maelstrom to gather up the troops together a little bit closer, and he drops a big gravity well. Mine's obviously on cooldown right now, but ooh, nice little sale. We'll take it. My gold has gotten really low from buying all my stuff, but you got your axe, he's coming in and he drops his gravity well. It gathers all the troops, they're gathered up, and then you go and drop your stun, and it stuns all the troops so they can't hurt anybody, but they're already grouped up, so they're not stunned spread out all over to Timbuktu, but they already got gathered. And then since the guy that dropped the gravity well knows that, okay, now they're gathered together, I'm going to go in and I'm going to stun them, which adds rend, and they're still stunned and gathered, so I'm going to go ahead and hit them with my armor breaker, which adds a ton of more rend. And one thing you want to know, rend is not going to stack. So you hear people talk all the time about, that spear applies such crazy rend, so you gotta have a spear because it gives that perforate. No, spear's good. I'm not trying to say it is not, but let's take a look at the hammer. So we got this hammer. It's got Sundering Shockwave. Shockwave inflicts rend, reducing target's armor by 14% for 10 seconds. That's basically the same rend as spear. Spear, as long as you hit all three hits of perforate, you're gonna put a 15% rend. So that one shockwave, you don't even have to worry about whether or not you missed. So that one shockwave is just as good as the spear for applying rend. But we also have our armor breaker, and as long as you come down here, armor breaker inflicts rend on the target, reducing target's armor by 20% for 10 seconds. So just between this move and this move, all of a sudden we have 34% rend on them just from our hammer. So we went ahead and we comboed them nice and perfectly. We gathered them all up into a group, and then we go ahead and we shockwave them while they're still grouped up, and our team can keep hacking and whacking away. They're doing the DPS while we're keeping them stunned and in place. Then we go ahead and hit them with our armor breaker, and they got all kinds of rend still on them. And we have another teammate that comes in and he hits them with weaken and perforate, and then maybe we go ahead and hit them with maelstrom, which also puts weaken on them. But for example, that's why it's important that you have different people in your group with different weapons. So let's say I go and hit them with a shockwave, and somebody else has a hammer that also has rending shockwave. They hit them, they're not going to stack, they're not going to do extra rend. But if I come and hit them with a shockwave, but then somebody else comes in with their spear and perforates them, well, that's going to be additional rend they have. So you want different members on your team having different combos. So if you're the one that's in control of the axe and the hammer in your group, it definitely can be a good thing. You know, you can get your combos right, you can keep things crowd controlled and stunned in the right order. And that's another thing to keep in mind. We have these grasping vines. I can't use them because they're not charged up right now, but that's another problem you run into. Sometimes a teammate will drop grasping vines just as you're ready to cast gravity well, and that gravity well gets wasted because it cannot gather them together because, well, they're rooted with the grasping vines. So kind of something to keep in mind. You know, obviously if you're in a situation and you have to use your grasping vines, you're dead. You know, you can't worry about whether or not somebody's trying to gravity well the groups together, the troops, the mobs together. And yeah, so you just got to be careful of that kind of thing and not stunning or not rooting things at the wrong time. So preferably you gather them together and then you stun them. Then you go ahead and use your leeching vines and you lock them in place and you keep DPSing them. So the idea is you gather them up and then you keep them gathered up and you keep hacking and whacking away. So once we do that, then we come in and we knock them down again while they're still stunned in place, and by that time we might have, you know, another one of our abilities back up. And see, so even though the hammer isn't a high DPS weapon, we're doing big AoE damage, so we're constantly doing big damage to all of the troops. So we can still end up putting out, you know, some pretty good quality DPS just because we're doing lots of damage to lots of mobs at once with the hammer axe combo. Not really a combo that I would highly recommend, but one place that it actually is a very strong combo is in Lazarus, because your hammer is going to do additional damage, so it's actually going to get you pretty high up. Anytime you're facing ancient mobs, the hammer is actually going to be a decent DPS weapon. You can run 3-man, 4-man. You can run 3 to 4-man squads with a hammer and a great axe. I've ran some runs where all 4 of us, I was the tank, and all 4 of us are running hammer and great axe, and you can mow through that place pretty darn good because you're just constantly keeping everything stunned. You're constantly keeping everything grouped up very, very nicely. So we covered a few more concepts there, but let's move along to, let's say, the spear. What do you want to pair the spear with? Well, you can pair it with quite a few different options. The spear is going to scale off of dexterity and off of strength. So it scales primarily off of dexterity. So higher dexterity is going to be better than higher strength. So let's just go ahead and we drop our con back down. And so ideally with the spear, we're gonna want to try to get to 2. If we are rocking the spear, we're gonna try to get to, say, 250 dex first, and then we're gonna put the rest that we have into strength. And like, let's say this is the combo that we're rocking. You say, well, that's terrible because, you know, the axe, it scales off of strength, but you only have 150. Well, we are not trying to do damage with our axe. It's there to gather the mobs, and then we go to town with our spear. And the spear does do some pretty good damage. It's not the highest DPS output weapon, but it does decent damage. But moreover, it applies some very, very good utility. And namely, perhaps the biggest, most important thing you can have in your group. Enfeebling Skewer. Skewer hits apply weaken, reducing the target's damage by 44% for 8 seconds. So you absolutely want to have this on your spear, because if you put it on your gear, it's going to reduce this number by quite a bit. But that's a crazy number. A 44% weaken from one single skill, that is going to add the survivability to your whole group by a megaton, because you weaken the mobs and it helps everybody out on your team. It doesn't matter how much DPS you can do against a dummy that's, you know, just on the wall and can't hit you back, and you say, oh, look at all these numbers that I'm putting out. And you can go ahead and check your DPS output by going to, say you go to the fort, but there's this little thing outside here. I think inside the fort there's some dummies too, but like this is Everfall, for example. But you find the fort, and then there's the little outpost outside, and then there's little dummies here that you can hit and test your damage output of one weapon versus another. You know, that's kind of what I'm referencing here. So you're hitting a little dummy on the wall and you say, oh, look at how high DPS this is doing. But if the mobs are killing you and they're not being crowd controlled, well, it doesn't matter how much DPS you can do if you cannot sit there and survive while doing that DPS. Or if you're just DPSing one mob at a time because you're not grouping them up properly. So definitely very important to have a spear, because you're going to get, or you need to have this perk on your spears. Enfeebling Skewer. If you just have 2 perks, that's more important than anything else on your spear. Get your Bane and get your Enfeebling Skewer. Absolute must have. You know, like I said, you can actually get away with, you can have 3 man that'll get away with a great axe and a hatchet. You can do it. But it is going to be better if you can optimize even more and you get somebody in your group with a spear. They apply that skewer, and then, well, perhaps at that point, well, you got one guy in your group rocking axe and hatchet, you got another guy in your group rocking axe and spear, and then you got another guy in your group with Ice Gauntlet Rapier. And now that you have some decent amount of crowd control and you got a big old weaken on the mobs, the guy with the rapier that does tons and tons of damage just comes in and he goes to town, and the mobs are weakened, so even if they do hit him, well, they're not going to do crazy amount of damage to him. But, you know, maybe let's make it even better yet. You got one guy with his great axe and his spear, you got another guy with a hammer, because that way he can stun him, and a great sword, and now we're getting even more optimized. So once we've gotten to that point where we're even more optimized, you know, we are actually getting away from that, this is extremely versatile build. Like I said, I love it. You can get away with it in any dungeon. You can have all 3 players running this build and you can make it work. But the dungeons have been getting harder and harder, and the more optimized you are, the better. So as we start optimizing more, we are kind of getting away from this build. So for example, we have one guy with our great axe and our spear. He's applying enfeebling with his great axe, he's applying enfeebling with his spear, and he is also going to be applying some pretty decent rend with his spear. And there's different options you can take for the last, but I do like sweep. I think that's what most people probably run, is sweep. So you get an extra knockdown. It's got a really short cooldown, so anytime you can knock the mobs down when they're knocked down, they can't hurt you or your teammates. But we also have this nice rend effect. Execute 3 quick piercing strikes that deal 80% weapon damage and apply rend, reducing the target's armor by 5% for 10 seconds. So we get 3 stacks, and as long as we hit all 3 perforates, that means we get 15%. Then rend increased to 10% per strike. So how I mentioned earlier, this does actually get better than the axe rend, so I stand corrected on that one. I forgot that this perk bumps it up. Rend is increased to 10% per strike against targets. So it's not going to apply to every target, but oftentimes we are going to get in there and we're going to apply this rend right away. So it might not last for the whole length, because obviously you're going to get below 50% health, and as the rend wears off, well, it's not going to be applied anymore. But it's where the hammer, that 20% is going to apply all the time. But once again, we're not always going to be able to hit every strike. Sometimes a mob comes and knocks us and we get knocked, and then we only get 2 strikes off, or one of them misses for whatever reason. So whereas with the hammer, anything you hit it. But that armor breaker, it can be kind of annoying and you can miss it as well. But the shockwave on the hammer, that one is a little bit harder to miss. It can still happen, but so the hammer is an incredible weapon for adding rend. Spear is also very good because you can add up to 30% rend with your spear hits against a mob that's above 50% health. So we got our axe for gathering, and then we come in with our spear, we hit them with the quick skewer, and we perforate them. We're doing some good damage, but we're also doing great utility. So we made them super weak, and we made them so they take a lot more damage. So every hit we do is going to do more damage. Every hit our teammates do is going to do more damage. So there we go. We got one teammate with our axe and a spear. We got another teammate that perhaps he has a hammer and a great sword, because the great sword does incredible AoE DPS. Depending on how you build it, it can add some good rend as well. But it's gotta be up there as being just sitting there on hitting a dummy on the wall. It's close to the top of DPS. The rapier build might beat it, but thing is, the greatsword just slashes and lashes through everything. Just such a big AoE hit that it has, and it just goes right through everything. So definitely something that you want to have. Oftentimes you're going to end up with 2 to 3 great swords in your group, but it is good if you can stack some different options, because every debuff that you apply from the same weapon, they're not going to stack. But if you apply debuffs and from different weapons, they are going to start stacking up a little bit more. So perhaps we have one guy with a hammer and a great sword. We got one guy with a axe and a hatchet, and then the last guy, he could be his rapier and his ice gauntlet, or his rapier and his void gauntlet, or he could be a fire staff and an ice gauntlet user, or a few different options. You could have a third great axe and hatchet user, a great axe and spear user. So definitely a few different options you can get away with, but I would say a really optimized group would be one hammer and greatsword guy, 1 axe and hatchet guy, and 1 rapier and ice gauntlet guy. So you're gonna be, the guy with the ice gauntlet, he can apply some rend depending on his build. If he takes ice shower, thing about ice shower, it doesn't cover tons of mobs and it doesn't cover them for really long, so it's not like it's a crazy rend. But he got his ice storm, which can apply slow and do some big AoE damage. Well, he's doing some more big, bleed damage, and yeah, just pretty much just a DPS type of guys what it comes down to. But he can apply a little bit of utility as well. So let's see, any other builds that I didn't cover that I should? Well, we do have the blunderbuss. I'm not gonna get too carried away talking about that. There's like a blunderbuss fire staff build you can do. Musket, it's just not any good for PvE. It's just the way it is. There's probably some bosses you could get away with it that you need range for, but let's just face it, musket PvE doesn't mix. The bow, you can definitely use that. It's not going to be like optimized for whole dungeon runs, but it could do alright if you're running spear, bow, something like that. Or else if you just have your bow on the back bar and you're mainly using your spear, but then when you get to a boss, then there's certain bosses that they're just easier fought with a ranged weapon. So definitely can be a very strong option to have a spear for boss fights. So it is a viable option, but once again, it doesn't have a ton of utility, so it's not going to be the best weapon for full dungeon runs. Sword and shield, it actually does some pretty good DPS. It's one of the higher output DPS, but once again, you're not doing a ton of really good. I've ran it. It's alright, but I didn't have that much fun running it as a DPS. I guess maybe in part because I run it so much as a tank. But it's okay, but I wouldn't highly recommend it for DPS. We talked about the rapier, very strong, hatchet, very strong, spear, very strong, great axe and warhammer, extremely good for AoE damage, and then the great sword, one of the best DPS weapons in the game, just far and wide. There's just no question about it. There's many different builds you can use. Different people argue different things. I love this build. Some people, a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this build. This isn't so much about the build, but with the great sword, you can do roaring rupture, and once you take it down here in defiant stance, the shockwave pushes foes outward, but in onslaught stand, the shockwave pulls the foes towards you. And this can get you a little bit in trouble because you're light DPS and you go and use this and it sucks the mobs from all directions into you. But so it can be good, it can gather mobs, but personally I don't love this. I'd rather rock. Obviously you could do both. You could run the roaring rupture and you could run a great axe, but I would rather run the build I have and run it in combination with the great axe. That way the great axe is for gathering them, and then we go ahead into our great sword, we rush through them, we go ahead and we use our big, personally I'd probably hit them first with this guy here, the skyward slash, then we go into the crosscut. And there's many different builds you can do with this great sword. And as far as perks on your great sword, this isn't the absolute best one, but it's pretty good. Chain fire, the reason it's mainly good is because it's against angry earth. So vicious, we're gonna do 12% critical damage every time we hit them. So obviously most people like to have, thwarting strikes, is that what it's called? Whatever, it's the perk that makes you do extra damage on every heavy attack you do, which for the heavy attacks are key with the greatsword for the most part. But a lot of times when I'm running it, I'll be running spear and greatsword or whatever. Sometimes axe and greatsword, and I'll be basically mostly sticking to abilities. I'm using my spear to apply the rends, to apply the weakens, knock them down. And then basically I'm coming to my great axe, and then I'm going to apply another rend, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit him with our crosscut. And by that time, you know, the crosscut is a huge damage dealer. But before we hit him with the crosscut, we hit him with the perforate. We got lots of rend on him. You know, we hit him with the skewer. We made them weak. We already, you know, we relentless rush through them, and then we hit them with another ability that applies rend. The skyward slash is going to apply rend, and then so we got a bunch of rend built up on them. And then we go and hit them with what's probably one of the biggest DPS skills in the game, and that just wipes a lot of stuff out. But once we're at excuse me but once we're at that point, the skills are back up on our spear. So we're going ahead and we're weakening things again. We're going to go ahead and rend them again. We're going to knock them down again. And then we're ready to go right back into the great axe. And we apply rend. We hit them with a big old AoE damage. And we hit the crosscut. So you get the picture. So I'm not necessarily doing crazy amount of heavy attacks. It depends on the build. It depends on the situation. It depends on the group. But a lot of times I'll love to run this build. It's a very good build, very versatile, very strong. So I'll mostly just be cycling through skills, and for that reason it makes this actually a pretty darn good greatsword if you're running it in such a way, because a chain fire, you know, basic attacks, you know, we are going to be sneaking some basic attacks in there, but not a crazy. We definitely will, especially against bosses. You know, we're gonna be sitting there and hacking and whacking away. You know, we're gonna switch to our spear to do those two skills, but then we're gonna obviously get back into onslaught stance. We're gonna apply rend and hit him with the crosscut. But rather than switching back to our spear right away, we're gonna sit there and hit him with our great sword for quite a while, and then we might come back and hit him with these two, but then we're right back into the great sword, and we're kind of going at it. But definitely a very good one. I don't know if it's Thornton Strikes, is that what it's called, but that's what a lot of people love to rock on their great sword, is the perk that lets you do more damage on your fully charged heavy attacks. So that's why a lot of people will run different builds than I have, because they're relying more on their heavy attacks, where I'm relying a lot on the skills for my personal preference. And the thing is, a lot of mobs, you run this combo on them, they're going to be dead. You don't even need to do any heavy attacks. Maybe you're left having to do one heavy attack to them, and then they're finally dead. But you run through those skills and you don't have time to make use of your heavy attacks doing extra damage. But one thing you should know, the greatsword, it's supposed to scale, I thought I heard, equally off of strength and dexterity, but I think it does actually scale a little bit stronger off of strength. So let's see, we're mostly dex, and we're at 1559. And if we go more into strength, we're at 15. What was it? So 1558. All strength versus 1540. So yeah, we're less if we go all dex. So it does scale a little bit better off of strength apparently, or maybe it's whatever. Regardless, that's not really what my main point that I want to talk about right here. Plus 10% base damage to heavy attacks. So if you are running your greatsword based on doing heavy attacks, you do want to get to 300 strength to get that extra 10% bonus to your heavy attacks. But if you're running it in such a way that you're not doing crazy amount of heavy attacks, you're doing it based more on running through the skills, you can just go ahead and run it up to 250 strength and then go ahead and put the rest into dexterity. And that should maximize your damage output. So you can see 1584, that's even higher yet than going all strength. So can maximize your damage output by just going to 250 and then the rest into dex, and we don't have to worry about losing that 10% bonus because we're not going to be using it a crazy amount. Just depends on your build and the situation though, so take that into account and run it the way you want. So what else have we not touched on here? So Void Gauntlet, Oblivion. Summon a 5-meter radius rift of void energy at your feet for 6 seconds that deals 30% weapon damage per second to the enemies and grants empower to self and friendlies, increasing damage by 15%. So that's a nice little bonus. It used to be that you always needed somebody to have this in your group. I think that this empower was a lot higher before and it got nerfed. Something like that. But anyways, it's not an absolute must-have, but it's not a bad idea. For example, if you have your rapier user that's running his bleed build, to run the Void Gauntlet instead and give everybody in your group that extra empower. But the Ice Gauntlet is pretty strong too. It's going to give you extra AoE damage. And one thing I've learned a little bit through testing is sometimes the time you spend trying to apply rend, sometimes the time you spend trying to apply empower, you cannot make up the damage that you could have been doing in that time that you're spending, wasting, doing, applying those debuffs. It's not always going to be the case, but for example, let's just say, I have a mob here, he's in front of me, and what's going to be the best way to take him out? The fastest, perhaps he's a strong mob, he's a soldier in Genesis, so we do want to make sure we hit him with Enfeebling Skewer, but from that point on, the fastest way for me with this build to take him out is to go ahead and, well, I did that combo wrong because I should have did this one first to apply the rend, but that's okay if we did hit the crosscut first. But if I just go ahead and hit him with my combo with my greatsword, where I do Relentless Rush, and then the Relentless Rush, it puts me into Onslaught. And then I'm going to go ahead and do Skyward Slash, which is going to apply 15% rend, and then I'm going to hit him with Crosscut. So I'm already applying some rend, and I'm doing heavy damage all along the way. So if I just stick to my greatsword, I'm going to finish him off faster than if I say, well, I'm going to sit here and play around with my spear, applying all these debuffs. A lot of times it is faster for me. Like, I've tested it on dummies too, seeing what options are going to allow me to do the most damage in a certain set period of time. And I was able to do more DPS by just doing straight damage with my greatsword versus, applying the rend and then pulling the greatsword out. By the time I do all that, well, I could have had the mob just taken out with my greatsword. So it's give and take, of course. That's not taking into the fact that, like, if you have a big group of mobs and your whole team is hitting them, they are going to be hitting them while you're applying the rend. So that rend is going to apply to everybody in your team. So it's not going to be the same case for whether you're taking on one solo mob by yourself or if you're taking on a big, huge group of mobs. So if you're applying rend while your other team is hitting them with high amounts of DPS, well, that rend is going to apply to everybody, and your whole team's going to be able to bomb whatever it is down just a lot faster. So every situation is going to be slightly different, but there are going to be times when it's going to be faster to just find your highest DPS output and just mow that mob down without worrying about applying all of your debuffs. So there's times you're not going to be able to make up your time back. So going back to that whole situation with the Void Gauntlet, yes, this is going to give us some extra empower, but it's going to take away some utility from, say, taking the Void Gauntlet instead of taking our Ice Gauntlet. Well, let's get our rapier on here too. So typically what we're doing, I do have a full video on this build, so go ahead and check that out. But typically what we're going to be doing, we're going to go ahead and place our ice pylon, which comes in handy. A lot of times it's going to help save us, like we get in a tight situation where we got a couple of knocked players and mobs are chasing everyone around. We can drop our ice pylon. Well, for one, see, we get this quick frost. It gives us a little bit of a haste, so that means if we're in trouble and we're running through that quick frost, it's going to help us escape the enemies faster. So there's many reasons why this is potentially helpful. So we go ahead and drop this. We're going to move faster. Then we go ahead and drop an ice storm. And that storm, it's going to slow down the enemies. So we're moving faster, they're moving slower, so this can help us and our teammates survive. And another reason it's going to help our teammates survive is because the mobs are going to get distracted by that ice pylon. They're going to go chasing after it as if it was another player. So you got some teammates that are down and you're trying to revive them, but the mobs are after you. You go ahead and do that, you do that, and well, the mob decides I'm going to go after the ice pylon. So you say, okay, I'm going to come and revive my teammate here, since the mob stopped chasing me and chased my pylon instead. So there is more to it than just doing as much possible damage and as much possible empower as possible. But the ice, you're typically, I'm not going to be running it Entombed. It depends on the situation. I was running it in Genesis, but most other places, and probably Genesis too, I'm going to be running some different, I'll be running a third, either a damage perk or else Ice Shower, which will add some rend to the mobs. But anyways, I just wanted to, talk a little bit of concept, how, in theory, maybe you say that you should absolutely run Void Gauntlet for the Empower instead of your Ice Gauntlet, but the extra damage that you're going to apply some big, huge AoE to big clumps of mobs with your Storm, and while your Storm is going off, you're also doing damage with your Rapier, and then your Ice Pylon, it lasts for a long time. It's going to die faster than it wouldn't because the perks aren't kicking in that are going to make it live longer, since it's just sitting here in the wide open doing nothing. But the point is, the amount of extra damage that we are going to do with our ice is probably not going to be made up by the extra empower. There might be situations and cases where it will, because that empower is applying to all of our teammates as well and not just ourselves. But we also do lose the extra utility of having the Ice Gauntlet, which can come in very handy. So like I was saying at the beginning of this video, I want you to understand concepts more importantly than just what puts out the highest number of DPS and that kind of thing, because DPS, high DPS that cannot be applied due to situations, well, it doesn't do you any good. So at the end of the day, you're going to be best off having a wide variety of different DPS builds, because if you have 3 spears, yeah, that would be okay. You could have a strong group that has 3 spears and 3 great swords. That's fine. You probably can mow through some dungeons pretty good that way, but the debuffs are not going to stack. So it's going to be better off if you have one guy rocking the spear for the rends on the spear, another guy rocking the hammer for the rends on the hammer, but plus the knockdowns, which add to survivability. And then you have another guy rocking a great axe, that puts off a little bit of a nice enfeebling, not as strong as the spear. But the point is, having 2 guys with spear is going to do less enfeebling than 1 guy with a spear and 1 guy with the great axe. So the great axe, the big thing with that is going to be the gravity well, but adding some additional enfeebling is going to be nice. But the maelstrom, besides adding enfeebling, it helps group the mobs up. So the more different types of rend you can add from different weapons, the more different types of weaken you can add from different weapons, it is going to add to your survivability. So survivability is key in killing the mobs as fast as possible, just as much as it is of having just crazy output. So you gotta you get so many people in the mutations that, it is good to have high DPS, but you see all of these different groups saying, we need 3 extra super duper extremely above and beyond DPSs that have the most DPS in the game that was ever possible. But a lot of times those are the teams that just get wrecked. They say, oh, look at us, we're 5 players with great swords, and we're all in the onslaught, and we're all doing crazy amounts of damage. Let me make sure I'm saying that right. Yeah, we're all in onslaught stance. When you're in onslaught stance, you take extra damage, and when you're in defiant stance, you take less damage. I'm all about the onslaught stance. I'm not saying anything against it, but you get 3 great sword users all in the onslaught stance. Nobody applying extra weaken, nobody crowd controlling the mobs, and pretty soon you have a full team of people knocked and crying and whining. And what do you know, another failed M10, and well, that's not fun because you don't get loot and you do not get shards. So just saying that, we need somebody that has crazy high DPS. Yes, you do need some of that, but DPS that cannot be applied does nobody any good. So you're far better off having multiple sources of rend, multiple sources of weaken, and just be a versatile group. So that kind of covers all of those concepts that I wanted to cover. But I'm also going to talk a little bit more about gems and weapon types for specific dungeons. And once again, you're better off having a wide variety of weapons versus having, well, this mob is weak to this weapon, so everybody should have this weapon. Yes, it is possible in some dungeons, like for example, Lazarus. You can absolutely smoke Lazarus with a group that has 4 hammers and 4 axes that are just doing big AoEs constantly, keeping everything constantly CC'd, but you're also doing big AoE damage. Even though you're not doing high amounts of DPS, you're doing decent amount of DPS to large numbers of mobs at one time, so it all adds up to take out the mobs pretty darn fast, and they never have a chance to hurt you because you're just constantly CCing them. So, and to start off with, Ancient is weak to hammer, so it does make the hammer decent DPS weapon in that specific dungeon. So although you can get away with that type of approach, it's not necessarily going to work in every dungeon, in every situation, for every group. Once again, you're going to be better off in general having, maybe one guy with a spear, one guy with an axe, one guy with a hammer, that kind of thing. So we're going to talk a little bit more about weapon types. What kind of gems do you want into your weapons, and so on and so forth. So generally speaking, if you're fighting against Angry Earth, if you just throw a ruby into your weapon, you're going to be good to go. Even if your weapon does slash damage, your slash damage does a 20% bonus, but fire damage does a 30% bonus. So you're not absolutely maximized, optimized, yada yada, but you're going to be doing additional damage. Even if you have an axe that you stick a ruby in, you're probably going to be a little bit better off to, say, put a opal in. You're going to do a dodge, and then you're going to do some damage, and it's going to be a higher output than the ruby. But at least the ruby gives you more damage and not less damage than base level. So you can't go wrong. Or say you have a spear, just stick a ruby and it's going to make you do 30% more damage for 50% of your damage. So that's basically like saying you're doing 15% more damage all of the time. So basically it's almost you're turning your spear into a slashing weapon. Not quite the same level of output exchange, but you get the point. So you have a spear, just go ahead and throw a ruby in there. Or better yet, if you are into it and can afford it and you're willing to do it, these aren't that expensive. You can go ahead and put like an augmented ignited ruined glass case into your spear. You're only going to convert 40% of damage to fire, but you're also going to inflict burn, dealing 8% fire damage per second for 2 seconds. So you're doing some extra DOT. So you're going to do an additional 8% damage in addition to converting 50% or 40% to an additional, So it's not like you're doing a crazy amount more, because you're losing 10% of that damage being converted, and instead you're getting like this dot of doing an extra 8%. But it's going to do a little bit more damage, but not crazy amount. So everyone should put one of these in every weapon, right? No. Well, these do not stack, so it's really only going to be beneficial for one person in your group to have these. And obviously, it's going to be common for people to put that specific type into their weapons. So if you do stick this in, at least, and you know other members in your group to have that exact same one, it's not going to stack, but at least you are still getting the 40% conversion to fire damage. So it's not all loss, but it's not all gain if you do have multiple people in your group rocking that same ruined glass. So one thing you could do is, you might not be better off putting, say, you can have it converted to different things in fire, but then you're going to lose that additional damage by having it converted to fire. So if that's the case, go ahead and just throw a ruby in your spear, but then throw, you could throw a different type into your other weapon. But so basically what it comes down to is, at the end of the day, if you just stick with the normal gems, make sure you're converting it to weakness if possible, or if not, just go ahead and throw a cut pristine opal in them. So you're going to be fine just sticking regular gems in there, because if you have other people in your group running the same ruined glass, well, you can maximize that kind of stuff if you are running with a set group and you have communication. But if you're just doing a group finder group, it's going to be pretty hard to say, well, I have this ruined glass, so hopefully you have that ruined glass, so we don't overlap. But that's not realistic in random groups by any means, so it's not too big of a deal if you just stick to regular gems instead of upgrading to these ruined glasses. But that's another way to do yourself a little extra damage. Just keep in mind that if you'd like to buy one of these ruined glasses, they are going to cost you, maybe a few K gold or something. Nothing crazy, but, that's a few K more than just buying a regular gem that might cost you 200 gold or so, maybe 300 gold. But it is an option. So let's talk a little bit about the mob types. We know, obviously, we've talked a little bit about it with Angry Earth being weak to fire and weak to slash, but Ancients, what are they weak to? We already did talk about how Ancients are weak to hammer. So if you are going to be doing Ancient dungeons, I have the hammer for you that everybody should have. Where is it? Where is it? I know I didn't take it out, did I? Maybe I did. Oh dear, I must have took it out. I can't believe that. But anyways, if you are going to be running against Ancients, let's just pretend that this is an Ancient hammer. Ancient are going to take 20% additional strike damage, which a hammer does strike damage. So let's pretend that this is Ancient Bane and Sundering Shockwave. This would be the perfect hammer for your Ancient dungeons. But they actually take even more lightning damage. They take 30% lightning damage. So let's see, I have this has a lightning gem. I don't have any of my ancient weapons on me, but that's okay. I do have the gems, so let's take a look. Electrified, convert 50% of damage dealt to lightning. Scales off of base weapon stat or intelligence if higher. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to throw one of those into our hammer, and we are going to do an additional 10% for 50% of our damage. Or maybe we say now we're just going to throw a gambit in there because that's going to help us out even more. But at the end of the day, you're going to be safe to throw a cut pristine topaz even into your hammer. It's going to help you do more damage instead of less damage. Might not be totally optimized, but it's not going to be a bad option. But let's say we have our great axe, and we have our enfeebling maelstrom hopefully, and then we have to have ancient bane. I do have that axe, but it is in storage, and I don't want to waste time going to show it to you. Oh, nice, another sold. Perfect. I just put a bunch of stuff on the market because my storages are so ridiculously stuffed. But anyways, I just put a bunch of stuff and just sell it for way too cheap just to try and get it to move. But anyways, I couldn't put a lightning gem in here because this specific axe has a nature perk on it, so I could only put a nature perk in here. So that's one thing you do want to be careful. So you find an awesome axe and you think, oh, this thing has ancient bane, it has shirking nature and enfeebling maelstrom. That's awesome because it's going to do extra nature damage. It's got this ancient bane, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put a lightning gem in there, so it's going to do even more. Oh wait, why won't it let me put it? Huh? What? Oh, that's because it has shirking nature. If you have a nature perk or any other perk besides, so let's just say I don't know if it's such a thing. I'm pretty sure it's not, but let's just pretend we had shirking lightning. Then it would work for us to add a cut pristine topaz gem. But that's not something that we have, so it does not work. Something you want to be careful. I have made this mistake before. I'm thinking, oh, this is awesome, and then, well, I can't convert it to what I want to convert it to. So we're losing out on some extra DPS. At the end of the day, not the end of the world. You just go ahead and put a gambit in there, and it's going to be good enough. Not optimized, but good enough for now until we find something better that doesn't have a perk that stops us from being able to optimize our build. So when it comes to ancients, typically you just want to stick a cut pristine topaz gem into your weapons. Unless it's a hammer, then you could just stick a cut pristine opal. That way you're going to do 15% more damage while your stamina is not full. So you have your hammer out, you do a dodge, and then you hit them. You see, you just did 15% extra damage than you would have done. So that's going to do more damage than having the cut pristine, but it's not going to be the end of the world if you did have a cut pristine in there either. So generally speaking, you are going to want to have a hammer, or you're going to if you don't have a hammer, you want to convert damage to lightning, because it does 30% extra damage, where the gambit only does 15% extra damage if your stamina isn't full. So you're gonna have a similar outcome, because you say we have our axe, and this converts 50% into 30% more damage. So it's basically like saying we have 15% more damage at all times. Where the cut pristine opal, it only perks if our stamina is below 100%, which is going to be pretty often, but it's not going to be absolute 100% of the time. So 15% all the time versus 15% 70% of the time, which is higher, 15% 100% of the time. So go ahead and just stick the lightning gem in there instead of the opal. Unless it's a hammer, then go ahead and stick the opal in there. So just a little bit of important information when it comes to gems. I do see people sometimes just saying, oh, it is a, it's it's a void mutation, so we're just going to stick void gems in everything, including our weapons. But you do not want to do that. Make the right weapon gem choice for your weapons. So we're going to go do a corrupted. Well, corrupted is weak to thrust by 20%. And, well, 15% to nature, but we're not going to worry about that because they are weak by 30% to arcane. And I don't have any gems in here that convert to arcane right now, so like you're like, which gem does that? Well, one easy way to solve that, you come over to your stone cutting table, you scroll down to the gems, and then you can kind of scroll through them, see what it is. We get down here, convert 15% damage dealt to arcane. Oh, sweet. So if we go and fight corrupted, we should probably go ahead and put a cut pristine sapphire gem because it's going to convert extra damage. Well, something like a spear is already gonna have an additional 20% damage bonus. So with a spear, for example, say we have a spear, would be just fine putting our pristine opal, or cut pristine opal to be more exact. But we have an axe, and well, we're going to be better off going ahead and putting that arcane gem in there. So anything that does not do thrust damage, we are gonna want to go ahead and put a cut pristine sapphire into that specific weapon. So if you have a melee weapon that does not have a specific strength against the mob, you do want to convert when possible. So Angry Earth, we already talked about that. That's gonna be ruby for fire, or else if you have a slashing weapon, then just go ahead and put the cut pristine opal. How about lost? They take extra damage to strike, but it's only a 10% bonus. So here's a case where even if we have our hammer, which does additional damage to lost, well, they do take 30% nature damage. So we have our nature gem here, cut pristine amber, that converts 50% of damage to nature. So if we go ahead and throw that in our hammer, it's basically going to be like adding 15% damage versus 10%. So it's going to give us a 5% bonus, but still might be better off just going ahead and putting that cut pristine opal. That way we get 15% extra damage on top of our already 10% plus to the strike damage. But anything else, you'd be perfectly fine. Just throw a nature gem into your hammer, and you're gonna be doing fine. You're gonna be perfect. But any other weapon that's not a hammer, go ahead and throw a nature gem in there if you are fighting against the lost. And when we get to the human dungeon, we kind of run out of the options to convert to magical types because they do not have any elemental weakness except for the bosses. The bosses, I believe specifically, both have weakness to ice. But the problem is it's only the bosses, so we're not really necessarily better off converting to ice unless we have a specific weapon that we are using just for the bosses alone. So they are the human, if we go to the human dungeon, they are weak to slash by 20%. So say we have an axe, we have a great sword, we have a hatchet, we're just going to want to go ahead and put a cut pristine opal. But there isn't any specific damage type other than ice for the bosses. So if we have a specific weapon for the bosses, we can go ahead and put the ice You're gonna have to double check me on that one. I believe that the bosses are weak to ice, but I don't know that 1000% sure. So double check me on that one. But if I'm correct, but then again, how many people want to have a separate weapon just for the bosses? But in the human dungeon, it's kind of nice because they are a pain. So say if you're fighting melee for most of the dungeon, it's actually super nice to have range for the bosses. So it's not a bad idea actually to have a separate ranged weapon that you are using against the bosses. And then if that is the case, just go ahead and throw yourself an ice gem in there. Or perhaps you're going to use an ice gauntlet if you're playing mage or something, and then you're already doing ice damage. So not a bad idea to have an ice gauntlet for the bosses in that dungeon, but other than that, they're not taking any additional damage to ice. Other than there is a few lost mobs in there in that human dungeon, but we're not really going to talk about mixed mobs in different dungeons. It's not like it's a total mix like some of the other dungeons, but there's a couple of lost named bosses in there. You know, not the big main bosses, but the little guys, the little bosses. So if we're going ahead and we're fighting the humans, we're going to try and take a slash weapon, and pretty much everything, whether it's our slash weapon or anything else, we can just go ahead and stick a cut pristine opal in there. That means that we put a cut pristine opal in there, we do a quick dodge, and then we do some damage, and we do 15% extra damage. So definitely going to be a good option. In the human dungeon, just go ahead and stick a cut pristine opal in there, regardless whether it's a slash, whether it's thrust, whether it's strike damage like the hammer does. You're gonna be just fine. Just go ahead and stick a cut pristine opal. And of course, if you want to get carried away, you can go ahead and get some type of conversion to, you know, if it's the slash damage, you don't want to convert it away from slash. But if you wanted to, you could get something that does a tick damage. Let's go take a look at this, at these rune glasses real quick. So we say, well, we want to invest a little bit, and we're going to try and do a little bit of extra damage. So perhaps we say, well, we're going to go ahead and we're going to use a, let's see, hex. Nope, we want the frozen one. We want to do a little bit of extra damage, and we know that the ice does a little bit extra damage to the bosses, so we're going to be efficient. We're going to stick a rune glass of frozen opal. So frozen gambit, 12% plus 12% damage while your stamina is not full. So instead of 15%, we only get a plus 12%. But hits inflict frost burn, dealing 8% ice damage per second for 2 seconds. So we're going to be getting that nice extra tick of 8% extra damage. So even though they're not additionally weak to ice damage, this would be a good option to go if we are using the same weapon for the bosses, just because we're still going to get that extra tick. It's only an additional 12% instead of an additional 15%, but we are going to get the additional 8% tick damage. So that's like getting an extra 16% plus 12%. You know, we're getting close to an extra 30% damage instead of just an additional 15% damage. So that would be a good option to go. Even though they're not specifically weak to ice, the bosses will be, so that would not be a bad option for you to run in this specific situation. But that kind of covers that. Not gonna go crazy in depth into any one specific concept. If I do that, it's going to be in an individual video specifically talking about that one specific topic. More or less, I want to cover concepts in this video, and so I hope you're getting that point that well, be versatile. Use different weapons and try to get a wide range of weapons for wide ranges of crowd control, wide ranges of debuffs, whether it be rend, whether it be weaken, applied from different weapons so that they will stack for one, and so you have different types of crowd controls. You got your axe to gather, and then once they're gathered, you stun them. It's kind of important to try and do it in the right order when possible. So this is a DPS video, but I'm just adding a little thing about tanking. A lot of times, a tank is going to run a hammer and a greatsword, and the first thing he comes in and he does a shockwave. So the only problem with that's fine, but the only problem with that is it does stun them, and you wait a little bit extra longer to gather them. That's one reason when I'm running as a tank, I absolutely love running with a hatchet, because instead of doing that stun to taunt the mobs, I love to just go ahead and I taunt them with my berserk, and then I go ahead and set up and I block with my shield, and instead of getting stunned, they come up and gather and they all group on me super nicely. Then somebody can come in and drop their gravity well, and then somebody else can come in with their axe, somebody else can come in with their hammer and stun them, and they don't necessarily need to. I can usually keep them grouped up pretty nicely just because I keep them continuously taunt with my hatchet that has like pretty much endless taunts. But we're not going to go super in depth into that. I do have an in-depth tanking guide you can go check out if you would like to see that as well. But that is one thing that does sometimes screw up some of the combos. It makes things take just a little bit longer to set up. If the tank stuns the enemy and then he comes and sits on the other side of the mobs and he blocks, well, it takes just a little bit longer to set up. But if you come in with your hatchet and you taunt everything, it's going to make everything get focused on you. Then you switch over your sword and you block and you do a little bit of damage with your sword. You block some more, and then when they're ready to be taunted again, you pull out your hatchet and you go ahead and taunt them again. But I'm not going to get super in depth with that. That's just kind of a little bit of information on the grouping of the troops, the mobs, the enemies. So I think that kind of covers just about everything that I want to cover in here. I guess I didn't really talk too much about the fire staff, so we'll go ahead and do that. Let's see here. I'm just going to go ahead and switch to my Angry Earth build for my fire staff. In part, anyways. I guess I should talk a little bit more about jewelry and that kind of stuff. I haven't really done that yet. So, let's see. I don't have an absolute best fire staff, but it's decent. It does the job quite decently. Acceptably anyways. And then here is my ice gauntlet. So, my fire staff is obviously already doing fire damage. And so I decided to get... Oh, wait, what? Oh, no, I screwed up with that. I put the wrong one in here. That's crazy. That's crazy. Oh well, that's unfortunate. I just wasted several K on this one. I put Punishing Gambit into my your melee attacks deal plus 2% damage. That's crazy. That's crazy. Gotta fix that. So we won't talk about that. But I did put a ruby into my ice gauntlet. That way, my ice gauntlet, crazy as it sounds, that your ice is converted to fire damage, but since my Angry Earth is weak to fire, and this is my specific fire build, well, we throw a ruby into our ice gauntlet so it does some fire damage and does more damage. But so fire staff, it's not the highest DPS weapon by any means. In Genesis, it does pretty darn good because they are weak by 30% to fire. So in combination with that and a little concept I'm going to talk about here, well, we can do pretty darn well with the fire staff. So it does a little bit depend on your team's build, but you actually get the right team, you can mow through Genesis with even 2 to 3 mages. So even though you're not getting different things to stack, we're obviously working with fire. It's all about building up 5 stacks of fire and 5 stacks of smolder. And then when we hit them with Pillar of Fire, that's going to be one of the big damage dealers. You know, one of the single initial hits. Invoke a burst of flames with a 2.5 meter radius. The target area that deals 165% weapon damage. So that's pretty good. 165% weapon damage. That's always a good amount. Then Pillar of Fire deals 5% more damage for each stack of smolder on the target, and you can get up to 5 stacks. So that's going to do additional 25% damage. So we try to build. You know, this isn't a fire staff specific video, but it's just a little bit important to talk about just the basics. Eventually I'll probably make a fire staff guide. But so we hit them with our meteor shower, and the specific build, empowering meteor shower. So when meteor shower hits, gain 2.9% empower for 6 seconds, max of 10 stacks. So that's typically how I open up with in this build. Is I go ahead and I hit him with the meteor shower. I get the empower working, try and hit him maybe with a single attack depending on how far away, but for the most part we're going to hit them with the meteor shower. Then we're going to go straight into flamethrower, and we're going to wait until we get 5 stacks of fire built up onto them, and then we're going to drop a pillar of fire on them. So even though the flamethrower, it might not be doing as much damage in a second as, you know, a big huge massive swing from a greatsword, it's kind of got that little bit of versatility where you can just keep on just hitting that big group of mobs. You can keep the pressure on them, even though it's not doing as much damage per single hit. You're continuously just melting them. So it's easy, you know, even though you're kind of close range, you got a little bit of distance between you. So you have a little bit of a safety net to just keep on pumping out the damage. So even though you might not be doing as high of DPS per se, you might end up doing just as much or more DPS, or I should say damage. Yeah, DPS is fine to say too, because if we're putting out the more damage in a specific amount of time, that's more DPS. So it might not be more DPS than if we were hitting a dummy on the side of the wall, but the fact of the matter is our DPS might be having to dodge out of the way while we can just sit here and keep melting things. So we're just putting continuous AoE damage, and we might first open up with our what? Why isn't there? Oh, I must not have enough mana. That'll happen. I was wondering why it wouldn't work. You know, we might first open up. I'd probably drop my pillar first, but we start off with that, but we got some good ticks going. But then we go ahead and we start hitting them with fire. We got some empower built up. We're hitting them with our flamethrower. We got 5 stacks on them, and we go ahead and hit them with our nice pillar, and then we hit them with some more flamethrower. Get those 5 stacks, and then we go ahead, and we're not out of mana yet because our abilities wouldn't have let us be out of mana because, well, let's go and take a look at our build real quick. Right here, Meteor Shower. Meteor Shower gives you 3% of your max mana for each instance of damage dealt. So we got some perks built in. Even though I'm running out of mana immediately, we got some perks built in that won't let me run out of mana that fast. So even though I'm not able to do my casts here in demonstration, I won't be running out of mana like that because I'm hitting mobs and I'm getting extra mana back. So yeah, just kind of figured I better talk about the fire staff since I talked about the majority of the other ones first. But the fire staff, especially in Genesis, it's very viable, and it's going to be viable in some of the other dungeons as well. It's not going to be as detrimental to the mobs in the other ones as it is in Genesis, but just the fact that it's able to continuously just keep pouring out damage to groups of mobs. You just sit there and you keep roasting them. When your DPS, they might have to dodge away for a minute. You can typically just sit there and keep on roasting away. So the fact that you can keep just that slightly safe distance, you know, obviously not a majorly safe distance with flamethrower. You're pretty close. You can't melt them from too far away, but you got that little bit of room to move, and you can keep wiggling and moving around the group. You know, you can keep yourself semi-safe. So even though it's not the highest damage output weapon in the game, just the fact that you can keep on applying pressure, keep on applying damage, well, that is going to allow you to help your team out decently. So let's just talk a little bit about perks. Refreshing Pillar of Fire is probably the big one that most people are going to go with. And I was running low on gold and running low on shards, so I had to see what I have, and this is the best weapon I had on me. Keen Speed, it's handy. It comes in handy in Genesis just because there comes in some instances where you have to run from mobs, and if you get this Keen Speed, it's like, oh, that was handy. But ideally I would have a damage perk here. But the Empowering Meteor Shower, it does help us do extra damage. And of course we have the Angry Earthbane, so that's pretty good too. But probably ideally we would have, you know, a perk to let us do extra damage on our crits. And then we would have Refreshing Pillar of Fire, which is going to allow us to hit these Pillar of Fires even more often. But the thing is, it's not that crazy necessary, since on our gear we have refreshing on all of our gear. 5 pieces of refreshing, which gives us a nice fast cooldown already on Pillar of Fire. So it's kind of a toss-up for me whether or not refreshing Pillar of Fire is necessary or not once I have refreshing on all of my armor here. So, and then with our Ice Gauntlet, this isn't, once again, not an absolute bist out Ice Gauntlet. It's handy. Healing Tomb, heal for 30% of your base health after Entomb ends. So it's a nice little bailout plan, but it's certainly not what my ideal Ice Gauntlet would. I'd rather have something like this. Unending Thaw, Ice Storm deals an extra 10% damage. So 10% bonus damage with our, that's huge. Frost effects remain on the enemies for 2 seconds after exiting the Ice Storm. So that's an example of a perk I like to have on my Ice Gauntlet. You know, this one isn't really, not so ideal. You know, we do want to focus more on doing more damage. Another one that's pretty good is there's one for the Ice Pillar. But that's about as far in depth we are going to get with those. There's an Empowering Fireball or something like that. That could be alright, but I don't even have Fireball on this build. There's a few different builds you can do with your Fire Staff that are going to be legit. There's an Incinerate build that can be pretty good, but a lot of people wouldn't have this specific combination. One of the main reasons I have this specific combination is because of the specific perk. So I go ahead and I open up with my Meteor Shower to start building up, you know, my Empower and start building up the stack. So I initially hit them with that, and then I start blasting them with my Flamethrower, which is going to start doing more damage because I have the Empower built up from the Empowering Meteor Shower. And then as soon as we get to 5 stacks, we blast them with the Pillar of Fire. So we're just constantly doing some really, really good AoE damage. So Fire Staff, not the highest DPS weapon in the game, but it is strong in Genesis and it can be viable. Ice Gauntlet, strong against, who was it strong against again? The Lost, I think. That's about the only one that it has a bonus damage against. So yeah, the Lost Mobs is the only one that has bonus damage against, and that's only a 15% bonus instead of the 30% bonus that nature damage does. But you know, the life staff does nature damage, but it's not a DPS weapon, so it's not like we have a specific nature weapon that we can use. Rumor has it that's perhaps the next weapon that's coming to New World is another focus weapon. Well, I guess that might not necessarily mean that it's a nature weapon, though. But anyways, we'll have to wait and see what that brings. But yeah, anyways, so if you're fighting against the Lost, you can use ice and you're gonna get a 15% bonus damage. But yeah, so flame only does extra damage against the angry earth, so you're not gonna get that huge bonus of extra damage with the flamethrower or with your fire build in general, anywhere other than angry earth. But just that consistent output, it can be viable in other dungeons. There are other players that, you know, are at the top of the leaderboards all the time that do run mage builds in their dungeons, and a lot of times they're running with set groups, so that's a whole nother story. You're running with set groups, you can get away with some crazy stuff just because everybody is in sync all the time. But they definitely have gotten a little bit carried away with mutations. They've made them a little bit too hard. Genesis, for example, there's not that many groups that are finishing it. I don't know, it's probably, I wouldn't be surprised if there's like a 50% finish rate or something crazy like that at the M10 level. They've made it so ridiculous that unless you're optimized, you can have 5 really good players, but since they're not in sync with each other, they don't have a plan down, well, 5 really good players can fail a Genesis run just because they're not willing to work together. So as hard as the dungeons have gotten, it's more important to be willing to work together, and that's kind of a big part of this whole video is leading up to this one thing, is how you need to be pretty doggone optimized with how hard they have made the dungeons. Certain ones, especially Genesis, they've made it too hard at the M10 level. So few groups that actually finish it. You have to have it basically down to a science. And the groups that are running the 5-mans organized, they do have it down to science, and they make it seem like a breeze. And they finish it no problem. They do speedruns and finish it in like 10 minutes. So yes, it is still possible to just completely wipe these dungeons, but that doesn't mean that it isn't made too hard in comparison to what it should be. It's kind of put behind a wall of, right now it's almost put behind a pre-made wall. That Genesis especially, some of the other ones are still pretty viable. Lazarus, they're getting pretty hard to get a gold in a random group, but at least, you know, you typically can finish it. Tempest, usually pretty easy to, well, I shouldn't say easy, there's plenty of groups that will still wipe out pretty good on it, but if you get a group that's willing to stick it, you can still finish it. But sometimes in Genesis, no matter what, you get groups that aren't going to finish it. Even if they're all good players, they can't ever get in sync, and they can't get it finished up. So as things sit right now, you do want to be pretty optimized with your builds. You want to be pretty optimized, you know, in your squad in general. So get started with one of these strong all-around builds, and you know, as you progress, it is definitely going to be helpful for you if you can become like a 3-weapon DPS. You know, you have a couple of different builds that you can work with depending on what the rest of your squad is bringing. It's going to just make you a lot more successful in your runs just by being able to provide whatever the rest of your squad is not providing. So I think I covered just about everything I want to cover. Covered the weaknesses of all the mobs, covered the different potential weapon builds and weaknesses and strengths of different weapon builds, but weaknesses and strengths of having a variety of weapons. Well, didn't talk about the life staff because that's not a DPS weapon. Void Gauntlet, a little bit talked about that, and skipped ones, bow. I'm not going to go super in depth with this one. Basically, if it's your offhand that you barely ever use and you just use it in situations where it's handy, that's alright. Use it against bosses, that's alright. But it's not going to be super helpful for your team running main bow. Unless you have maybe 2 other ranged, you got 2 fire staff users or something. If you can figure it out, more power to you. But generally speaking, trying to run in random groups, people aren't going to be accepting you as often if you're running mage or if you are running range, such as a bow build. And the blunderbuss, there can be a pretty strong build that you can run. I don't have it selected right now. I don't even have it leveled up. I only have it at level 12. But there's a blunderbuss build you can do along with your fire staff. That's pretty decent, but not gonna really go too in depth with that. It shouldn't be your main weapon by any means. So covered all the main topics, and I think that's gonna do it for now. So hope you have a good one. Ask any questions below. I know we kind of jumped all over the place, lots of random stuff. Probably missed a million things that I wanted to cover, and just trying to think. One thing I'll talk a little bit about, as you do get better and better gear, it is nice to get a couple of extra perks on your armor. Not super necessary. It's going to be enough just to have the one main extra perk on your weapon along with Bane. That's going to be the main thing that you want to look for. Have one very strong weapon perk on your weapon, have Bane, and you're going to be good to go. But if you can, start looking for extra secondary perks on your armor here and there. For example, on my hat here, I got lucky, and I don't know if this was a drop or if I found it on the market, but anyways, Angry Earth Ward plus Freedom, which is pretty handy. It's not an absolute best perk, but it's handy. And then we have Bleeding Sweep. So when I'm using my spear, my sweep is going to add a bleed, which is going to do extra damage. So just look for little things like that to help improve your build as you go. But getting started off, just the most important thing on your gear, have something like Angry Earth Ward and Refreshing, Angry Earth Ward and Freedom. But at the most basic level, when you're first doing your first dungeons at level 60, mainly you're looking for having the right attribute. 1 or 2 perks that are okay is helpful as well. But just get started. The more you run the dungeons, the more drops you'll get, and sometimes you might get a drop that you can sell for a good price, and then you can afford to buy some of your armor and weapons. Or other times you're going to get that specific armor or weapon to drop for you. So that covers everything I think I wanted to cover in this video. So questions, leave them below. Definitely will go more in depth into single individual topics later in different videos, but this was just intended to be a very broad overview to get you pointed in the right direction and get you thinking more along the lines of concepts versus thinking I need to have the single one most highest DPS build in the game. But if you're looking for that, I have my Rapier Ice Gauntlet build out there, which is one of the highest output of DPS builds in the game. So it's good to have somebody that has that super high DPS. But in closing, do not have 3 people running Rapier bleeds, because only one person's gonna benefit from it, and your team is probably going to wipe from not having any CC. But that covers it. I hope you have a good one, and we'll catch you on the next one.